Picture yourself for a moment in the steel confines of a Panther tank during the brutal summer months of 1944. You're a German commander, enclosed within what many consider the finest armoured fighting vehicle the Third Reich ever produced. Whether you're weaving through the tight, debris-littered alleyways of a shattered Italian town, or pushing through the suffocating bocage countryside of Normandy, your attention never wavers from one critical danger: foot soldiers with anti-armour capabilities. Your training has prepared you for this. You understand the warning signs. When an American infantryman unleashes a bazooka round, the weapon betrays him instantly. A brilliant flash erupts, followed by a telltale ribbon of white exhaust that draws a perfect line straight back to where he's crouching. When a British Tommy squeezes off a round from his anti-tank rifle, there's a visible blast from the muzzle. These signals are everything to you. They're the difference between life and death, telling you precisely where to rotate your turret and where to direct the devastating fire of your MG-42 machine gun to eliminate the threat. Then, without any warning whatsoever, catastrophe arrives. No brilliant flash illuminates the battlefield. No smoke signature betrays an enemy position. No advance notice of any kind. Just a hollow mechanical impact, immediately followed by the horrifying sound of superheated metal slicing through your tank's side plating like tissue paper. Flames begin consuming your vehicle, and the most terrifying part? You have absolutely zero intelligence on the origin of that devastating strike. You've just encountered a phantom. This phantom wasn't some cutting-edge technological marvel. To be completely honest, the infantry who lugged it across battlefields thought it resembled salvaged metal piping from a demolished construction site. Meet the Projector Infantry Anti-Tank, the PIAT. By every measure on paper, this weapon should have been classified as a complete failure. The thing was impossibly heavy, grotesquely awkward to manoeuvre, and depended on an enormous brutish steel spring that demanded almost superhuman strength to prepare for firing. The recoil was legendary. Canadian soldiers regularly ended up with horrific bruising across their shoulders after just one shot. The troops cursed its existence constantly, ridiculing its rough-hewn construction when compared to the streamlined elegance of America's bazooka. Yet here emerges one of the most fascinating contradictions in the entire arsenal of World War II. While Allied soldiers complained bitterly about this weapon, German forces, from regular Wehrmacht units to the elite Waffen-SS, developed a genuine visceral hatred and terror of this particular instrument of war. What explains this paradox? Simple. Unlike every rocket-propelled anti-tank system of that era, the spring-driven PIAT never revealed where it was fired from. It functioned as the perfect ambush hunter. When placed in the determined hands of Canadian infantry, who deployed it with remarkable ingenuity from the ruins of Ortona to the flooded lowlands of the Scheldt, this supposedly inferior piece of equipment evolved into the soundless terror that haunted German armoured formations. Before we can fully appreciate why the PIAT represented such an extraordinary threat, we need to clear up a widespread misunderstanding. When examining World War II combat footage, it's tempting to group the PIAT together with weapons like America's Bazooka or Germany's Panzerschreck, but from an engineering perspective, they're completely different animals. The Bazooka and Panzerschreck functioned as rocket launchers, fundamentally hollow cylinders engineered to direct a rocket-propelled grenade toward its target. Pulling the trigger initiated a rocket engine, which propelled the warhead downrange. The PIAT, conversely, wasn't a rocket launcher at all. It operated as a spigot mortar. At its core wasn't a rocket engine, but rather an enormous, powerful mainspring constructed from steel, a component that looked more appropriate for heavy vehicle suspension than portable infantry weaponry. The operating principle resembled a massive explosive crossbow more than anything else. Let me explain the mechanics. Contained within the weapon was a substantial steel rod, the spigot. Restrained by that powerful spring assembly, pulling the trigger released this spring, which drove the spigot forward with brutal force into the projectile's tail section. This collision detonated a propellant charge housed inside the bomb's rear. The resulting explosion hurled the projectile toward its target, while simultaneously forcing the heavy spigot backward, recompressing the spring and resetting the weapon for subsequent firing. The concept sounds brilliant on paper, But operating this beast was absolutely punishing. The mainspring possessed incredible stiffness. Preparing the weapon manually for initial firing demanded roughly 200 pounds, approximately 90 kilograms of raw pressure. This wasn't something you could casually prepare while lying flat in the mud. Soldiers frequently had to stand upright, plant the buttstock firmly on the ground, and leverage their complete body mass to cock the spring, an extremely vulnerable position during active combat. Then there was the recoil issue. Because the system relied on a heavy mechanical spring combined with a contained explosion, the kickback was absolutely savage. Canadian veterans frequently joked that they deserved medals simply for surviving the act of firing it. If a soldier failed to brace it properly against his shoulder, the recoil could cause severe contusions or even dislocate the collarbone. This was a weapon that inflicted nearly as much punishment on its operator as it did on enemy targets. Yet this primitive, shoulder-bruising design delivered the single tactical benefit that German forces came to absolutely despise. Rocket launchers like the Panzerschreck generated an enormous backblast signature. When German infantry fired a Panzerschreck, a violent jet of flame and propellant gases erupted from the weapon's rear. This backblast created two critical problems. First, it made firing from inside structures or confined spaces absolutely suicidal for the operator. The pressure and heat would kill him instantly. Second, it generated a massive plume of dust and smoke that immediately broadcast the shooter's exact position to every hostile tank and marksman within visual range. The PIAT produced no backblast whatsoever. Because the explosion occurred entirely within the bomb's tail assembly and was absorbed by the spring mechanism, there was no flamejet shooting rearward, no enormous puff of revealing smoke, no muzzle flash. This meant a Canadian soldier could remain concealed in tall vegetation, discharge his weapon, and stay completely undetected. Even more critically, as the war progressed into the tight demolished urban centres across Italy and the Netherlands, this characteristic allowed the PIAT to be fired from inside cramped rooms, something German anti-tank teams physically couldn't accomplish. While German engineers sneered at the PIAT's unsophisticated construction, German tankers experiencing it firsthand learned a harsh reality. A primitive weapon that remains invisible is infinitely more lethal than a sophisticated one that announces its presence. If Normandy's open terrain proved dangerous for armoured vehicles, the narrow, rubble-clogged streets of European cities became absolute kill zones. Here, in the claustrophobic horror of urban combat, the PIAT truly dominated, and this is where German forces began developing genuine hatred for it. No engagement demonstrated this more clearly than the Battle of Ortona, frequently called Italy's Stalingrad. This was merciless close-quarters combat where Canadian forces battled house by house, room by room against elite German paratroop units. In this environment, German anti-tank teams confronted a devastating limitation. If a German soldier wanted to engage an approaching Canadian Sherman tank with a Panzerschreck, he had to expose himself in the street or at minimum position himself in an open doorway. Why? That lethal backblast we discussed earlier. Firing from inside a small room meant the pressure wave reflecting off the rear wall would either kill him instantly or transform the space into a furnace. The Canadians, however, wielded the PIAT. Because it generated no backblast, a Canadian soldier could establish an ambush position deep within a destroyed building. He could lay flat on a dust-covered floor 5 meters behind a window, completely shrouded in darkness. When a German Panzer rumbled down the street, its turret sweeping blindly, the Canadian could fire through the window opening without revealing himself. The tank crew would register the impact, experience the explosion, but observe nothing. No flash from the window, no smoke signature, just a silent strike emerging from the shadows. This capability transformed every window, every basement vent, every breach in a wall into a potential death trap. It forced German infantry to meticulously clear every single structure, reducing their advance to an agonizing crawl while steadily eroding their morale. But the PIAT possessed another characteristic that Canadians exploited masterfully: its ballistic trajectory. Most anti-tank weapons fired in a flat, high-velocity trajectory. You aimed directly at the tank and the rocket flew straight to impact. The PIAT, being a spigot mortar, launched a heavy projectile that travelled comparatively slowly in a steep arcing path. At extended ranges, it dropped dramatically. While this made engaging moving targets at 200 metres extraordinarily challenging, in urban environments it became a unique asset. The PIAT could be employed for indirect fire. Canadian troops rapidly discovered they could elevate the weapon and lob projectiles over obstacles much like conventional mortars. Was a German machine gun team sheltered behind a stone wall or rubble pile? A flat trajectory bazooka couldn't reach them, but a proficient PIAT gunner could arc a high-explosive bomb over the barrier, dropping it directly onto the enemy's position. This flexibility meant the PIAT transcended its anti-tank role. It became portable artillery. It could blast through doors, collapse walls to create mouse holes, a technique Canadians perfected in Ortona for building-to-building movement without exposing themselves to street fire, and eliminate sniper positions. For German defenders, this was absolutely maddening. They were accustomed to confronting enemies they could see, or at least enemies whose weapons obeyed conventional ballistic principles. The PIAT obeyed no such principles. It could strike from enclosed positions without warning, and it could rain destruction from above onto supposedly solid cover. In the capable hands of innovative Canadian infantry, this awkward spring-powered tube transformed the urban battlefield into a labyrinth of invisible threats that German heavy armour simply had no answer for. To truly understand why German forces despised the PIAT, we must enter the psychology of a German tank crewman. By 1944, Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS tank crews were arguably the most battle-hardened armoured warriors in military history. They operated according to strict survival protocols refined on the Eastern Front. Their fundamental survival principle was straightforward: target identification and suppression. When ambushed, a tank crew's only survival option is immediately locating the fire source and saturating that area with machine gun fire and high-explosive rounds. If they can see the enemy, they can eliminate him or at minimum suppress him sufficiently to prevent follow-up shots. The PIAT completely dismantled this survival doctrine. In after-action reports and prisoner interrogations, captured German soldiers frequently expressed deep, simmering frustration regarding Canadian anti-tank tactics. They described the experience of fighting ghosts. When a PIAT struck, German crews often panicked, not primarily from the damage itself, but from their inability to determine which direction to orient their turret. They would spray machine gun fire wildly into hedgerows or ruins, expending ammunition on empty shadows, while the Canadian gunner, calmly concealed and undetected, prepared his spring for a second, fatal shot. This inability to counterattack created widespread paranoia. It shattered the German crew's sense of superiority. They weren't being defeated by superior machinery. They were being hunted by something invisible. But the hatred wasn't purely psychological. It was brutally physical. The Germans might have ridiculed the PIAT's appearance, calling it a plumber's pipe, but they couldn't dismiss its warhead. The PIAT fired a HEAT, high-explosive anti-tank projectile. Despite the weapon's crude launching method, the bomb itself proved highly lethal. It could penetrate approximately 100 millimeters of armor plating. For context, the side armor of a Panther tank, Germany's medium tank masterpiece, measured only about 40 to 50 millimeters thick. The formidable Tiger featured 80 millimeters of side armor. This meant that at close quarters, a cheap stamped metal PIAT could punch straight through the pride of German engineering. When a PIAT bomb detonated, it didn't merely explode on the surface. The shaped charge concentrated the blast into a hypersonic jet of molten copper and superheated gas. This jet pierced the steel like a red-hot needle through butter. Inside the tank, the effect was catastrophic. The jet would spray molten metal and hot spalling, shrapnel from the tank's own interior wall, throughout the crew compartment, igniting ammunition stores and fuel lines. The hatred also extended to German infantry supporting the armour. They felt utterly helpless. Their mission was protecting tanks from enemy tank hunters. But how do you defend a tank from a weapon that produces no smoke trail? You can't trace the projectile's flight path back to the bush concealing the Canadian. There's a documented incident where a German commander, upon surrendering to Canadian forces, requested to inspect the automatic anti-tank cannon that had devastated his column. When Canadians displayed a PIAT, he reportedly refused to accept it. He felt insulted that his technologically superior machines had fallen to a spring-loaded tube. This captured the essence of German hatred. It represented professional resentment. To them, the PIAT felt fundamentally unfair. It was an assassin's tool, silent, lethal, and frustratingly effective in the chaotic, broken landscapes of Western Europe. To genuinely understand why Germans feared the PIAT in Canadian hands, we cannot depend solely on technical documentation. We must examine the men who employed them. Because of the PIAT's vicious recoil, challenging cocking mechanism, and limited effective range, it wasn't a weapon for the faint-hearted. It demanded nerves of steel, and no soldier embodied this raw courage more than Private Ernest Smokey Smith of the Seaforth Highlanders of Canada. On a rain-drenched night in October 1944, Smith's unit had forded the Savio River to establish a precarious bridgehead. They were isolated, outnumbered, and entrenching in the mud. Suddenly, the unmistakable rumble of Maybach engines cut through the storm. 3 German Panther tanks, supported by self-propelled guns and infantry, were advancing to annihilate the Canadian position. A Panther tank is a terrifying adversary. Its frontal armour is virtually impervious to most Allied weapons. To destroy it with a PIAT, you cannot engage from 200 metres. You cannot engage from 100 metres. You must close to suicidal range. As the lead Panther rolled down the road, sweeping the terrain with machine gun fire, Smokey Smith refused to withdraw. He grabbed his PIAT. While his comrades held their breath, Smith waited in a roadside ditch. He allowed the 45-ton behemoth to approach until it was virtually on top of him, a distance of merely 30 feet, approximately 10 metres. At that point-blank range, the German crew had zero chance of detecting him. Smith rose, steadied the heavy weapon, and pressed the trigger. Thump! The shaped charge warhead smashed into the Panther's side armour, crippling it immediately, but the engagement wasn't finished. 10 German infantrymen riding on the tank's exterior scrambled off and attacked Smith. Demonstrating incredible ferocity, he dropped the PIAT, seized his Thompson submachine gun, and killed 4 of them, forcing the survivors to retreat. Later that same night, another tank counterattacked. Smith waited again. Once more he exploited the darkness and the PIAT's silent discharge to his advantage. He fired again, compelling the second tank to withdraw. For his actions that night, Smokey Smith received the Victoria Cross, the British Commonwealth's supreme award for valour. His story illustrates the ultimate paradox of the PIAT. It was a weapon that soldiers loved to hate. It was cumbersome. It bruised them mercilessly. The fuse mechanism was unreliable, but in the chaos of nocturnal ambushes, where stealth represented the only thing keeping you alive, it was irreplaceable. The Germans hated the PIAT because it empowered individual infantrymen like Smokey Smith to confront heavy armour on their own terms. It transformed the confident advance of a panzer division into a tentative, fearful crawl where every shadow in a ditch could conceal a Canadian with a spring-loaded pipe and a heart of iron. As the smoke dispersed over Europe in May 1945, the PIAT began its slide into obscurity. It was rapidly superseded in the post-war era by the American Bazooka and subsequently the Swedish Carl Gustaf. By contemporary standards, the PIAT represented an evolutionary dead end. It was unwieldy. It delivered punishing recoil, and its loading procedure was a nightmare for any soldier under hostile fire. From a strictly engineering perspective, it was arguably among the most poorly designed weapons of the entire war. Yet examining it through the lens of history reveals an undeniable reality. It succeeded. The German Wehrmacht, a force that took immense pride in technological superiority, in Tiger tanks, V2 rockets, and jet aircraft, found itself perpetually frustrated by a basic steel tube and a spring. They despised the PIAT because it robbed them of the one element they depended on most: predictability. They could predict a rocket's trajectory. They could predict an anti-tank gun's firing position, but they could never predict where a Canadian soldier with a PIAT might be concealed. For the Canadian Army, the PIAT evolved into a symbol of their distinctive combat philosophy. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't glamorous. It was gritty, pragmatic, and demanded sheer physical toughness to employ effectively. It was a weapon that required the user to hold their ground, wait until they could see the enemy up close, and stand firm. While American GIs enjoyed the luxury of engaging from standoff distances with rockets, the Canadian PIAT gunner had to close to intimate range. The legacy of the PIAT isn't found in its technical specifications. It's found in the burned-out hulks of Panther tanks littering Ortona's streets. It's found in Normandy's hedgerows where German offensives were halted by invisible assassins. And it's found in Smokey Smith's Victoria Cross, which proved that a single soldier with a spring gun could halt a blitzkrieg. The Germans despised it because it violated the rules of conventional warfare. The Canadians employed it because it won battles. Ultimately, this silent nightmare earned its place in history, not by being the finest weapon ever designed, but by being exactly the right weapon at precisely the right moment.